Good afternoon and welcome to a very special interview show of The Prode. Just a few days back, Russian President Putin declared that Russian forces have taken control of Mariupol city of Ukraine. There have been several videos surfing on the social media that show the bodies of dead civilians in the city. The situation is getting worse and there is no hope of a ceasefire as of now. To talk about all this and much more about the Russia-Ukraine crisis and its geopolitical impact on the neighboring countries, I'm joined by a very special guest from India, General Anil Malik. Lieutenant General Anil Malik has served as the Chief Advisor of the Indian Military Advisory Team to Zambia, Director of Security Affairs at the Eurasia Division of the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, and the Director General of Discipline, Ceremonials and Welfare at the Indian Army Headquarters. He is a renowned geopolitical expert and a speaker. Thank you so much, General Saab, for your time. A very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jai Hind, and it's a great pleasure to be on the show. There are numerous issues which are presently of concern to each one of us, whichever part of the world we are in. And these issues, while they have no easy answers, but then they are concerns which we can all share and put our heads together to see what best comes out of these. There are no fixed answers. Nobody knows exactly where the situation is heading, but I'm sure there are logicals and reasons and which exist. Each party has its own perceptions. So let's see how we could get along.
Yes, sir. So I would like to begin the discussion by asking that how do you see the Russian claims of capturing the Mariupol city of Ukraine, and what is your overall assessment of the recent developments coming from the war?
Okay, without getting into the background to all this, we are all familiar with the background. This stems right from the time the Soviet Union broke up in 1991. Russia has been smarting over this issue. They've been waiting for opportunities. We know that since 1991, there have been, while ideally it would have been best that the Russians had been fully brought into the system to ensure a peaceful world, but NATO and the Western countries, because of their own interests and understanding, decided that they could play around, maybe put Russia on the back foot, which they succeeded, because they were neither economically strong nor were they militarily in a position to oppose anything that was going on. Now, we are all familiar that the first three countries which were part of the erstwhile Soviet Union, that's Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, were the first. In fact, they are the only three countries of the former Soviet Union which are members of NATO. But then we are also familiar that these were the three countries which broke off before the 1991. In fact, they left the Soviet fold in 1990. So obviously they have their own concerns, and that's why they decided that it was best to secure themselves by joining NATO. And now all this didn't trouble Russia too much. Why? Okay, these things hurt, but at that stage they were never in a position to oppose what was happening. Now, as they found that over the years, the Western footprint started appearing in Ukraine. Now, Ukraine's importance is well known. It's actually, I would term it as the soft underbelly. Ukraine controls all the ports, the entry to the Caspian, to the Black Sea, and thereafter, from there on onto the Mediterranean, which is the major trade route, flows through these southern portion. And that's why we saw a stage in 2014 when the Donbass area was more or less created as independent entities, though still under Ukrainian control. Thereafter, we saw Crimea getting into the Western fold. So now these things obviously upset the Russians. Nobody likes somebody else's footprints coming right at your door, something which can disturb your own peace. The Russians definitely didn't want the Western people to be having a foothold or a control in Ukraine, which would have magnificent effects on their own trade routes and sea routes. We're also aware that most of Russian gas and oil flows through Ukraine, right? Which is a major economic concern for them. So any attempt to enhance that foothold was not taken very pleasantly, and the present regime in Russia, particularly after Putin came into power, definitely didn't want this kind of a thing to be happening. So that being the background, and we are aware that there were Western instructors in Ukraine, weapons were flowing in, the training was being conducted, right?
Yeah.
But as the years went by, we realized that the attempt by Ukraine to get into a full membership of the NATO was something which was definitely not accepted. So that being the background. Now coming on to the specifics of as the operations have progressed since February this year. We are familiar that the Russians went in both from Belarus, from the north, from the northeast. A major offensive went in from the east, right, from the Donbas area, and also from the south. Now, the south and the eastern offensives had a different intent altogether, while the one which came in from the north and the northeast had different purpose. Now, let's look at the intention as it developed and why Mariupol has become so important, right? The intention from the south was definitely to secure the seaports, to prevent any interference with the Russian fleet, which is based out of the Black Sea. And like I said, the trade routes run through that. So the intention was very clear. Crimea was already there, but Crimea was also isolated to a large degree. We know that the Ukrainians at one stage after Crimea was usurped and taken over by the Russians, the water supplies to these areas were cut, dams were created on the Dnieper, preventing any kind of growth taking place there. And these are all very important agricultural areas. A lot of wheat grows there, and Ukraine, as we know, is one of the major suppliers of Ukraine wheat to the world. So now depriving them of this water was also an irritant. And in fact, if you are aware that once the offensive started, one of the first things was to remove those dams which had been created by the Ukrainians to restore the water supply, electricity, the free flow of electricity. And that's how the southern offensive was. And I have no doubt that the intention from day one was that the areas which are occupied in the south are going to be for keeps, right? It's what you call providing strategic depth to the Black Sea. Right? Yeah. Also, the purpose was to link up with the offensives coming in from the east, from Donbas area, so that you have a secure corridor, both on the eastern flank as well as on the southern. And the intention was clear that these are never going to be sort of returned. In fact, if you notice that in the initial period, the offensive was not from the south was not that hard in terms of destruction, right? Because if you want an area for yourself, you look less at destruction than more at. And there was also that feeling that the eastern region being pro-Russia would easily accept. Now, Mariupol per se became a what do you call thorn in the back, and that was because the Western powers put in their major efforts into preventing any such recapturation. Now, while the Russian intention initially was to make sure that we are able to capture these areas in a systematic manner without causing too much of destruction. But this doesn't happen. They did not foresee that the kind of resistance that would come in, right?
Yeah.
And because that resistance became so strong, and Mariupol's importance, as we've already discussed, that's when major destruction was being caused there. While as far as there's episodes of genocide, whether they're being done by the Russian troops or they're being done by the mercenaries who were also involved, a whole lot of mercenaries were involved in these battles. So whether they were being done, whether they're being done by the diktat from Kremlin, or there are isolated incidents, are difficult because we follow the Western media. There's very little information that flows out from Russia or areas which are more inclined towards Russia. Right?
Yeah.
So while these things are of concern, humanitarian issues are of major concern. If you remember, initially, humanitarian corridors were created, right, to let the civilian population, keeping the laws of war in mind, and keeping sure that the population suffers the least amount of casualties. But then the intense bombardments that followed and the destruction that is taking place, yet structured towards those targets which was felt to be of military nature. Yes, there are always collateral damage. Collateral damage has taken place. So these are of concern. We know that a whole lot of refugees have gone out, and the refugee issue is of major concern to each one of us. And equally important than the refugees who have gone across to Poland and to Moldova, to Romania, and such countries, is the internally displaced people. No international body takes care of the internally displaced people. So they are actually the worst sufferers. Okay.
Yeah. Sir, you talked about NATO?
Just to add one last point to it, as I see this offensive now, the one from the south, once Mariupol has fallen, the Russians have made it very clear they are not getting into the steel mills and areas, for reason that those involved fighting into built-up areas, which is a very difficult process. We all seen this in all wars, whether it was in Iraq or in Stalingrad or anywhere. The Russians are quite familiar with this particular thing. So to avoid that, they're not getting into those areas. Yet, those areas will perhaps be isolated and to prevent any interference. Okay.
Yeah. So
but the next objective, as I see, is this whole shift. One, linking up the eastern thrust with the southern thrust, expanding towards Odessa, right? Because Odessa is a major trade and a military port of significance. So if you have to seal off the southern corridor, then Odessa is going to be the next thing in my perception. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So you talked about NATO. So do you think that NATO's expansion is actually the main reason behind this whole conflict and it only triggered the whole invasion first? And if yes, then is it correct on the moral grounds to attack a country and its civilians just to uphold the principle of indivisible security?
I would not say that that is the major reason, right? But it is one of the triggers. They've used it as a trigger. In fact, Putin, when his initial thing before he went into this offensive, very openly told the West that do not get Ukraine into, and the reason is they don't want any outsiders to be in Ukraine, right? Number two, the democratic process which has been initiated in Ukraine is a threat also to to Russia. They don't want these kind of things happening at their doorstep, right? So, to a large extent, NATO's interest in getting more members is of consequence. But like I said, only 3 countries have so far gone into NATO. And the process itself, there is a divide within the European Union and NATO as to whether these countries, whether Ukraine needs to be brought in. And the process itself is not that tomorrow morning, Ukraine has been trying this since 2008. Right? In fact, 2020, when they made an amendment to the constitution, was actually the one which aggravated the situation, that we want to be permanent members of the NATO. Okay.
Yeah.
So while there have been attempts both by NATO and the Russians to ensure that we maintain a peaceful posture, we have these partnerships for peace, part of the NATO thing, where Ukraine and Russia both are members of that partnership. And the partnership is basically focused on ensuring that peaceful relations are maintained with Russia.
Yeah.
But absolutely, there is no justification to say that I will wipe out a country, right? In fact, when you were talking about the 2 northern offensives, they're basically meant to create a fear psychosis in the population. Look, get rid of the present regime in your country. Stop trying to get into this partnership or becoming part of NATO. And that's why you find that no serious attempts were being made to capture Kyiv or Kharkiv. But destruction was being caused. And that was to create that impact on the population. And there was a big hope that the population will rise up. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened, because the population of those areas, the western portion of Ukraine, is more inclined towards Western Europe than towards Eastern Europe. But just where it comes to humanitarian issues, where it comes to civilian population being harmed or killed, definitely these are areas of great concern to everyone.
Yeah. So coming to the geopolitical impact of the war on the neighbors of Russia, do you think that nations like Finland should join NATO, seeing what happened with Ukraine? We have also heard the news that Russia has threatened Finland with nukes if they will join NATO. So how do you see this?
You know that Finland, Sweden, these countries, particularly Finland, has a vast border with Russia. I think about 800 some kilometers worth of a border, which is of concern to Finland. All these years, the Finland has had very good relations with Russia. They have good trade relations. They are common people of common descent, which they are in the border areas. While they felt that the Russian threats will be there, Russia will try. And that's why the reason why they never thought of getting into this. Now, what additional protection are they looking for? Right? What they're looking for additional protection is that should Russia do to Finland or Sweden what they have done to Ukraine, then definitely they are looking at. They have also realized that the Western powers and NATO, while they may help them with aid and weapons and training and such like things, they're not going to physically get involved in the war. And this has been very obvious, whether it is President Biden's statements or NATO per se. No boots on the ground, right? As long as the war doesn't spill over to areas which are of NATO's domain, right? Now, what are these countries looking for? The fear is spreading. Though even now, the data that is emanating They're still talking about a 50-50 thought process. While the government in power may be looking at it, but the population, initially, if you know that hardly 20% of the people in these countries wanted to be members of NATO. Now, these are unofficial polls which are being carried out. And again, like I said, these are Western reports that we that look, there is a thrust that we want to become members of NATO. This is something we need to be watched. But they also have to understand that the process of getting into NATO doesn't happen overnight. It's not today morning I said, I want to be a member of NATO and say, okay, welcome, be a part of it, right? It doesn't work this way. It's going to take, this process itself is going to take years, even if you fast track the procedure. All the 30 NATO countries have to be firstly in agreement, right?
Yeah.
Number two, each country is to ratify acceptance of these countries. So the process itself is going to take time. But yes, the fear has set in. Now you talked about Russia's threat, right? Definitely, Russia doesn't want an expanded border with NATO. So, like they had threatened Ukraine. So also the same thing is now being applied to Finland, right? But I don't think that the way the Russian adventure or misadventure into Ukraine has gone in, will they try to do something similar to Finland or any other country which says that they want to join NATO? It's not going to happen that way. This is my personal assessment.
So coming to
concern, yes. Concern, yes. And this nuclear threats and such like threats are to be taken with a pinch of salt.
Yeah. So coming to the NATO, what are some of the major reasons behind the fact that US and other countries have decided not to send their military to help Ukraine?
I think the NATO charter is very clear. They are concerned about security. They provide interdependence. They have defense deal. They have interdependence on. They have a standby force which is meant to get involved if a country which belongs to NATO, which is a member of NATO, is threatened. Or should this war spill over, had this, say, let's say, it spilled over to Poland, there would be justification for NATO to intervene. Right? In fact, if you observe that none of the Russian thrusts have come down the western side of, and an odd incident of bombing along close to the Poland border was an odd incident. It's not something which they. So the Russians are also very clear that they don't want these other countries to actually put in troops, sending weapons, sending carrying out some kind of training, going down there, financial aid, taking in the refugees. Yes, these are humanitarian things. So I'm not very happy with the fact that more and more weapons are being pumped into Ukraine. In fact, I would say that you're preventing any kind of agreement being come about between the Ukrainians and the Russians, which at some stage needs to be brought. Right? It's not that Russia is not capable of capturing the entire Ukraine as it stands today, and nor would they like to do that because the population per se is not accepted. Right? So if that is so, then bringing in any kind of troops into thing is definitely escalates into a war which is beyond the control. So till the time aid and such things are being provided, fair enough, acceptable. But any direct involvement of troops, it is not in the interest of either Europe or those members the US hold over these or over Europe, right? Now, if US gets directly involved into a war with Russia, then I'm afraid things have gone beyond control of anybody. And these can have major ramifications on not only the geopolitical situation, but actual operations that it can lend itself to. Okay. So there's no way that NATO is going to actually physically, in fact, within NATO also, even for providing weapons, there's not a complete agreement on such like things. In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, yesterday or day before, Sweden has put in a veto on certain weapons being sent to Ukraine. Okay, some certain German weapons. The Germans themselves are not very sure whether they want to get actually directly involved. But by virtue of the fact that they are members of NATO and they have certain commitments, they agreed to provide certain arms and weapons to Russia, to Ukraine, I beg your pardon. But getting directly involved, see the effect on the energy situation in Europe. Last, I think, again, 2 days back, maximum oil, gas and oil pumping was done through Ukraine to Europe, okay, to those countries which are dependent on Russian oil and gas. Unlike us, where we are, our dependence on Russia is only about 10%.
Yeah.
Right. Germany and gets 40% of its gas from, and while the US has promised them that we will compensate for that, they're trying to draw new agreements, but the agreements, each one of them says, by 2023, we will stop our dependence on Russians. So nobody wants to get involved directly, because everyone, at the end of it, what happened? NATO is one important component. It's an alliance. It's a military alliance. But each country has its own personal interest first. National interest come before everything else. Right? So there's no way that NATO is going to actually physically send troops into. And if the United States decides to do that, which also they have clearly laid down, that no troops on the ground, then you can visualize the effect it's going to have on the US hold over the rest of the globe. You know, you can see the Chinese would love that if the Americans also got involved here. But it's not going to happen. Right? So there are agreements, and their agreement is very clear. Only if a NATO member is physically threatened can we come in physically to prevent such a thing.
So you talked about Germany, but many people don't know that it was Germany only who blocked the Ukraine's entry into NATO when it was decided earlier. So it was Germany only, and then the lecture
Germany has been playing a major role in all this. Germany's played a major role in the refugee issues. In fact, when Europe was very hesitant to get in the Syrian refugees, which were coming in through Turkey and Greece and all, and Angela Merkel was the one who opened the doors for the refugees. Right? So humanitarian issues, yes, they are concerned. But they understand that unnecessarily going in, poking your thing into Ukraine and trying to say, okay, no, become a member, right, has got major ramifications, which is not in their national interest. Okay.
So now,
sorry.
Now coming to India's stand, so how do you see India's stand on the whole situation? Although India acted very, very mature, but still Western countries think, or like most of some of the popular journalists based out of UK and US think that, you know, India's stand was very shaky and stuff. So how do you see this?
Just talked a little while back about Europe and national interests. Okay. Now, India's partnership with Russia is not a fair weather. Russia is not a fair weather friend. Okay. whether it was the 1971 war, we had eras of Treaty of Peace and Friendship. We have our major supplies of weapons, spares, everything comes from Russia. Oil and energy is not a major concern to us because, like I said, only just about 10% of our, which also we have overcome. So while India, what does the West want? We've had each country sending in their diplomats, senior leaders, have visited here. Boris Johnson has been here just 48 hours back, right? Each one, even Biden, at the end of his talks with Modi or Boris Johnson, have said that, yes, India has their interests and their relations with Russia. So we do not expect them to come out in open criticism. But yes, they all feel that India can play a major role because of its relations with both sides in trying to resolve the present crisis. Okay. But when it comes to issues like, should there be a genocide? The genocide thing was there at the Security Council and the General Assembly. India, while said clearly that we would like an independent inquiry to be conducted. Right? And whoever is to blame at the end of it needs to be looked at. But we will not take sides. So by staying neutral, and India has been a founding member of the non-aligned to start with, and we've always maintained a neutral stance. That's why we have a standing today in the world. People want to establish good relations with you. They want to have good trade with you. But we are not going to be taking sides on this particular thing. We are not saying that X is to be blamed or Y. But yes, if X does something drastic, definitely we will oppose it. Okay. But there are going to be no stand because, again, national interests come first. We have a position. We need to interject by way of, and which the Indian government has been doing, talking with Putin, talking with Ukraine, trying to put a stop to this. But so far, they maintain their stand that we are not going to be taking sides.
Yeah. Now,
definitely, our attempt is to put a stop to it, to prevent more humanitarian issues.
So, how do you see the global security initiative by China? Like China have proposed that all Eastern countries should come together to counter the hegemony of the West. So how do you see this idea and where do you see it going?
China is gradually wanting to emerge as a superpower. They have strengthened themselves militarily. They have strengthened themselves economically. Whether it is the United States, Russia, India, Africa, anywhere on the globe, they want to establish themselves with a position of power. Now, that power also comes from the fact that the West has also decided that we are going to oppose any expansion of the Chinese. While the Chinese keep saying that, look, this expansion of ours has nothing to do with military. Okay, it's not that we are we're going out to take away territory. We had an episode with China in 2 years back, right, or a year plus back. These were episodes which took place to prevent us getting too much towards the Western lobby. China has their own stand on various issues. They want to go into historical background. They also have to realize that history is past, right? You can't say that all these islands belong to us 5,000 years back, so we have a hold over these, right? So, but the fact of the matter is that any Chinese do not want any of these countries which are in that area, Southeast Asia, and there's a very large Chinese population in all these areas, getting into any kind of blocks with the West. Right? So Russia, Chinese will keep flexing their muscles where required, but per se it amounts to say that their aim is only to prevent. Why should the West be dominating these areas, and why can't the oceans be used by each one of us, right? So these things are going to continue, but the fact of the matter remains that any kind of direct confrontation with, whether it's with the United States or with any of these countries, doesn't seem very likely at the moment. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, sir. So I would like to conclude the discussion by asking that what does the future holds in terms of this conflict, and where have the Russians failed? Because many experts claims that Russia has failed in capturing Ukraine.
Russia, it would not be prudent to say that Russia has failed in what it did. I don't think the aim was ever to capture Ukraine. Okay. Number two, on the tactical level, there have been failures because they thought it's going to be a cakewalk. Right? Like they went into Georgia, everything came back into a controlled situation. Their aim would be now to control certain important areas. Like I said, provide depth to the southern areas, to make sure that their trade routes and the Russian fleet is not bound down by any of the Western countries. They would also say that the eastern areas which have a Russian population. So the purpose was going to be secure certain areas, and that's why they pulled out of, they've changed. You know, they had spread themselves too thinly on the ground. They did not use the air power the way it would have been used had it been to capture the country, right? These convoys were stretched for, there's very little logistics was catered for. Because the thought process was that this is going to be a short war. We go in, we threaten the people, perhaps Zelensky may be thrown out, and perhaps there'll be a regime change in Ukraine. And to start with, if you remember, Zelensky himself started talking about, okay, look, now I don't want to be a member of NATO. In fact, now he's more or less said that I don't want to be a member of NATO, because he's realized that NATO is not going to come and physically fight for you. So where is the destruction being caused? To his people and to the country, right? But yes, certainly Russians are going to secure certain areas. It's only then they're going to sit down back again on the negotiating table too. Zelensky's been wanting to talk directly with Putin, which so far Putin is not. But on the tactical front, definitely there have been a lot of Russian failures. Okay, the war has not gone the way they had thought it would. Two, they're also very clear that getting into built-up areas and fighting is something which can carry on for years. And particularly if you created, the more rubble you create, the more difficult it is to capture those areas, right? So it's not going to be that simple. But yes, I still feel that once they're able to link up the East and the South, secure these areas, they will be more willing to talk. And if Zelensky also has agreed to drop out his condition of joining NATO, then as long as they find that Ukraine is not going to be totally Western oriented, right, things will be acceptable to them. So we are looking at the next few days as the new offensive, which has been now, the troops have been pulled out and the offensive is now coming in more committed toward the east and the south. We'll probably find things, a more favorable situation developing.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for your time. It was a pleasure hosting you. Really hope that situation gets better soon. Thank you so much once again for joining.
Thank you. It was a pleasure speaking to you there. Like I said, there are no easy answers. There are no immediate solutions in sight. But I would also say that perhaps the West also needs to exercise a little more restraint now and trying to pump in more and more weapons, because you may be preventing immediate crisis, but you're not doing too well to the cause of the Ukrainians by trying to continue this war. The more weapons you keep pumping in, the more you're giving that the Ukrainians an idea that, look, we can continue to fight. Okay, because continue to fight means it can carry on for months, it can carry on for a year or maybe more, right? If it is to continue to fight. So the attempt should be to go slow on this. As is, a lot of this weapon thing is not to be taken too seriously again. A lot of the weapons are weapons which are not in use by anybody else. Okay, they're not willing to put in their frontline weaponry into this area. Okay. And then to be able to train the people to use those weapons. Now, in the middle of a battle, you give me a new weapon system, which I have no idea of. You can try and visualize what the implication is going to be. So let's hope there's restraint from both sides. Putin also realizes that it's not for him to go and capture Ukraine. And I think the intention has been made very clear with the new offensives that have been now coming in. That the aim is not to capture Kyiv. The aim is not to capture the western portion of Ukraine, right? So we hope things will improve.
Yeah, may better sense prevails on both the sides. And on this note, I want to end this interview. Thank you so much, sir, for joining.
Thank you.